She had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of 4 words. Honest treatment, guaranteed. When the door finally opened, the man standing in it was enormous still and completely unprepared. Not for her, not for the 2 small girls shivering in the snow behind her, not for any of it, because he hadn't written the letter. He didn't know she was coming. He didn't know she existed. And in the long, unguarded moment before either of them spoke, she saw something move across his face, something raw and old that she would spend the next 20 years learning to understand. He stepped back. The door opened wider. That was all. No welcome, no explanation. Just a man who did not waste words making room for 3 strangers in a Montana blizzard, because apparently that was the kind of man he was. This is the story of what happened next. The door opened onto nothing that made sense. That was the first thing Eleanor Whitmore understood when the cold wood swung back on its iron hinges, and the man filled the frame the way a cliff fills a skyline. Not with intention, not with threat, simply with presence, the kind that belongs to things that have always been there and cannot be moved by the ordinary forces of the world. He was enormous. She had known large men before, men who used their size as a first word in every conversation, men who let their shoulders do the threatening before their mouths caught up. But this man was different in a way she could not name in that first breathless second. His height was not a weapon. It was more like weather, something that simply existed and required you to adjust. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, amber shot through with deep gold. They moved over her face, then to Nell, then to Fern, and the thing that happened inside those eyes was not what Eleanor had been bracing herself for. There was no slow assessment of worth, no quick flash of calculation. What crossed his face in that long, unguarded moment was something rawer and older than any of that. It was recognition of a kind he had not been expecting. He had no idea they were coming. That much was written across him as plainly as weather is written on a mountain. The stillness that had been simply contained before shifted into something else entirely. He stood in his own doorway in the December wind off the Montana plain, and he did not move. A man who could split wood all morning without stopping had gone completely still in the space of a breath. Fern looked up at him. Her cheeks were apple red from the cold, and her feet in their thin shoes had long since stopped feeling anything, but she looked up at that enormous still man, the way a child looks at something wonderful rather than something frightening, and she said in a voice that carried the perfect confidence of 4 years old, "Can we stay? Mama says you wrote to us." The silence that followed was its own kind of weather. Before we go further into the story, if you are new to this channel, take a moment and hit subscribe. Every week I bring you a new frontier story told the way the old ones used to be told. And drop a comment below and tell me what city are you listening from tonight now. Back to that doorway, back to that silence, back to the man who had not moved. He did not answer the child. He turned his head back into the warm dark of the cabin, and he said one word. Not loud, not angry, just certain in the way a man speaks when he already knows the answer to the question he is about to ask. Silas. And in the particular weight of that single name, Eleanor Whitmore understood everything. She had come to Montana on the promise of a man named E. Hargrove. She was standing on his porch in the snow, and E. Hargrove had no idea she existed. To understand what this moment cost the man in the doorway, you have to understand the land he was standing on. You have to understand what Hargrove Ranch was and what it had already taken from him before Eleanor Whitmore knocked at his door. Montana Territory in December of 1874 was not a place that invited sentiment. The winters came in off the Canadian plain without apology, and without end, 8 months of cold that pressed down on the earth like a hand pressing down on a wound. The nearest town was Mill Haven, 17 miles east, over ground that turned treacherous the moment snow fell, which in December was most days and all nights. The ranch itself sat on 400 acres of black soil that William Hargrove had purchased from the territorial government in the spring of 1851 for a price so low it reflected nothing so much as the government's own opinion of Montana in December. William had been 28 years old when he arrived. He had a mule and axe, the kind of back that does not complain, and a belief so absolute in the future that it functioned as its own kind of religion. He built the main cabin alone in the first summer. Logs from the pine slopes above the property notched and fitted without any help because there was no one close enough to ask. He built the barn the following spring, the fence lines the summer after that. By the time he married Ann Ellis in 1855 and brought her west on the wagon that took 6 weeks to make the journey, he had built something that qualified as a home. Ann was gone by 1859, a winter lung sickness that arrived without warning and left without her. She gave William 3 sons before she went: Caleb, who was 5 when his mother died; Silas, who was 2; Drum, who was still nursing and would not remember her face at all, except as a smell and a warmth that disappeared one February and never came back. William Hargrove raised those 3 boys the way Montana ranchers raise children, which is to say with the same quiet expectation he applied to everything else he owned. He did not speak much of love. He spoke instead of work and weather and the keeping of one's word. He showed his sons what a man was by being one every day in their sight until the lessons stopped being something taught and became something simply known. He died in the spring of 1873 and left the ranch to his oldest son, along with a debt against the property that William had kept to himself the way men of that generation kept most of their private disasters in silence until silence was no longer an option. Caleb Hargrove had been 32 years old that December. He stood 6 feet and 6 inches without boots and carried his height the way the ridge above the property carried snow without effort, simply as the natural result of what he was. His hair was dark chestnut, thick, kept short for practical reasons and no others. His hands were the hands of a man who had been doing hard physical work since he was old enough to hold a rope. The skin of his face was weathered and tanned, and there was a quality to his jaw, something that stayed set even when the rest of his expression had relaxed, that suggested he had made peace with discomfort long ago and saw no reason to revisit the question. His eyes were the amber color that Eleanor noticed in the doorway, warm in a way that the rest of his face was not. This was the contradiction at the center of Caleb Hargrove. Everything about him said, "Stay back." His eyes, when you could get him to hold still long enough to see them properly, said something else entirely. He had been engaged once. Her name was Margaret Ann Clare, and she had lived on the property east of theirs, close enough to visit on horseback in a good half hour. She was 20 years old when they became engaged, and she had a laugh that seemed too large for her small frame, bright and sudden, and absolutely honest. Caleb had known her since she was a girl, following her father's fence line on a pony that was nearly as old as she was. He had fallen in love with her the way you fall into a cold river without deciding to, simply with the sudden and complete understanding that you were already in. They had agreed to wait. Her father wanted another year, then another. Caleb did not press. He was a patient man, and the future seemed very long to him in those years before he understood how quickly it could narrow. Margaret died in the spring of 1869. Childbed fever, the doctor said, a phrase that covered a great deal of suffering in very few words. The baby came too early and did not survive the week after his mother. Caleb had been standing outside the bedroom door for 4 hours when the doctor came out. He had listened to the sounds inside that room and been unable to do anything about any of them, which was the worst kind of helplessness, the kind that teaches a man that some things cannot be managed or worked or waded through. When the doctor shook his head, Caleb nodded once. He went to the workshop and he worked through that night with his hands because his hands were the only part of him he still trusted. By morning, he had carved a small figure from a piece of pine, a woman kneeling beside a child. The carving was rough in the way that things made in grief are rough, but there was care in every line of it, a kind of attention that was its own form of prayer. He placed it on the mantelpiece in the main room and he never moved it. He also never named the horses or the cattle after that. Some losses teach you things about yourself that you would have preferred not to learn. Silas Hargrove was 28 years old and looked like the kind of man who knew it. Not vain exactly, aware. He had his mother's auburn hair and a smile that arrived a half second before the rest of his face caught up with it, which gave the impression of warmth premeditated, and the impression was not entirely wrong. Silas was genuinely warm. He was also genuinely strategic in ways that he had learned to present as spontaneity. He was the brother who spoke to people easily, who remembered names and birthdays, and the small personal details that made strangers feel known. In a frontier town like Millhaven, this was a valuable thing. It had gotten Silas through 100 situations that would have left Caleb standing in uncomfortable silence or Drum standing in uncomfortable hostility. 3 months before Eleanor Whitmore appeared at their door, Silas had sat in the office of Homer Banks, the owner and sole officer of the Millhaven Territorial Bank, and listened to a set of numbers that added up to something he had been afraid to add up on his own. The debt their father had taken against the property for the cattle expansion of 1872 had grown over 2 years into something that the ranch's current income could not service, not without a very good spring, and the previous winter had not been a good anything. Banks was a man of 55, with a stomach that suggested comfort and eyes that suggested otherwise. He had a gold pocket watch that he consulted at intervals with the expression of a man who wanted you to know his time was valuable. The situation, Banks had said, without quite calling it a problem, would be considerably more manageable with some evidence of stability. Silas had waited. A settled household, Banks continued, the kind of arrangement that demonstrates long-term investment in the property, a family concern rather than three bachelor brothers. He had smiled then, thin and precise. Lending institutions are more comfortable with families. Silas had ridden back to the ranch that afternoon with the banker's implication turning in his mind. He had thought about Caleb eating dinner alone at one end of that long table every night for 5 years. He had thought about the carving on the mantel that no one was allowed to touch and no one ever mentioned. He had thought about the fact that Caleb was 32 years old and had not looked at a woman with anything other than courtesy since Margaret Clare died. He had thought somebody needs to do something. This was how Silas arrived at the Philadelphia newspaper, at the column in the back pages, at the advertisement that was placed under the heading Matrimonial Opportunities, Western Territories. He had read a dozen similar notices before he found the section for eligible women, and then he had done something that, even as he did it, he understood would require significant explaining later. He wrote a letter. He signed it E. Hargrove. The E, he told himself, could stand for either of them. The correspondence that followed over 3 months was careful and practical on both sides. The woman who wrote back from Philadelphia gave her age as 24 and described herself as capable of household work and willing to live in a remote location. She did not describe herself in any other particular. She asked no questions about the property or the income or the nature of the arrangement. She asked one question only, and she asked it in the second letter, in a sentence set apart from the rest by a single line of white space. Is honest treatment something that can be genuinely promised? Silas had stared at that question for a long time. Then he had written back yes, and he had meant it. The fact that he was not the one who would be required to demonstrate it was a detail he had chosen not to examine. He sent train and stagecoach fare. He received confirmation that it had been received, and then he had waited 3 months for the situation to somehow resolve itself before Caleb found out which was perhaps the most Silas thing about the entire enterprise. Drum Hargrove was 25 and looked it. Not young in the easy sense, not soft. Young in the way of something that has been through genuine hardship, but has not yet found the stillness that hardship eventually teaches if you survive it long enough. His eyes were storm gray and they moved quickly, taking in too much at once. The eyes of a man who is always deciding what requires defending and what does not. He had their father's law in their father's hands. He had also inherited a particular quality of William Hargrove's, that none of the three boys had ever discussed the way that grief, when it had nowhere to go, became something hotter and more immediate. William had been a cold man on the outside and a burning one underneath, and so was Drum, and neither of them had ever known what to do about it. He was fixing fence line on the north boundary that December morning, lone because he preferred it when the shape of a freight wagon appeared on the road from Millhaven. He watched it turn toward the property without particular concern. Supply deliveries came occasionally on Wednesdays. Then the wagon stopped at the house and the door opened, and 3 people got out, and none of them were the supply man. Drum set down his tools. He stood very still against the fence post and watched a woman and 2 small girls stand in the snow in front of the cabin door. He watched Caleb open that door. He watched his oldest brother freeze in a way he had not seen Caleb freeze since the morning of the doctor's headshake 5 years back. He started walking toward the house. Eleanor Charlotte Whitmore had been 24 years old for 6 weeks when she stepped off the freight wagon in front of Hargrove Ranch. She was 5 feet and 3 inches tall, with hair the color of honey in late summer, pinned up under a bonnet that had weathered 3 weeks of travel and looked it. Her eyes were a shade of blue that came and went depending on the light, sometimes the color of clear water, sometimes nearer to gray, the kind of eyes that changed with mood in a way that was very difficult to read until you knew her well enough to know what you were reading. She had a delicate look to her that was misleading. The delicacy was structural, the fine bones of her face and the slender line of her wrists, and it sat on top of something much harder that had been built over 3 years of a marriage that should not have lasted 3 weeks. She carried herself with the particular uprightness of a woman who has decided that if she cannot control the forces operating on her, she can at least control her posture. Her chin stayed level in circumstances that would have undone most people. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a bookkeeper whose own ledgers had never balanced quite well enough. She had been educated at a small church school where she had learned to read with the kind of thoroughness that comes from genuine hunger for the thing rather than obligation to it. She had read everything she could find for as long as she could remember. This had given her, among other things, an understanding of the distance between the way things were described and the way they actually were. She had known Franklin Whitmore for 4 months before she married him in the spring of 1870. He was 30 years old and worked in trade, which covered enough territory to be vague. He was not tall. He was not remarkable looking. He had a face that was easy to forget and a voice that was easy to listen to. And in the early months, those 2 things had seemed like qualities rather than tools. She had learned otherwise. The marriage had lasted 4 years, during which time Eleanor had kept a diary with the scrupulous honesty of someone who understood that records mattered. Not a journal of feelings, nothing so personal as that. A ledger, dates, figures, facts. The date in April of 1872, when Franklin had borrowed $40 from the Green Brothers Shipping Company at 15% monthly interest and had not told her until she found the papers in his coat pocket. The date in November of 1872, when she had understood fully and completely that the man she had married was capable of sustained dishonesty with no visible discomfort. The date in April of 1874, when Franklin Whitmore had disappeared. The official account was an accident at the factory where he had been working. A fire, a collapsed section of roof. The body was not recovered, which the foreman had attributed to the severity of the damage. Eleanor had stood at the small memorial the factory workers organized, and she had felt beneath the appropriate solemnity something she could not say aloud to anyone, but that she recorded in her diary that evening in 3 words, "I can breathe." Nell was 7 years old with dark braided hair and eyes that had been taking in information since she was old enough to focus. She was not a child who performed her feelings for adult reassurance. She observed. She waited. She made assessments with a quietness that her mother recognized and her teachers had always found unnerving in someone so young. Nell had watched her father's house for 3 years with those careful eyes, and she had understood more than anyone had told her, and less than she sometimes felt in the middle of the night. Fern was 4. Fern was different in every way that mattered. Where Nell held the world at careful distance, Fern met it head-on with a confidence that had no particular basis in experience, but was entirely genuine. She had apple cheeks and a gap between her front teeth, and she carried everywhere she went a cloth doll that had lost its button eyes somewhere in the 2nd year of its life. The doll was called Miss Buttonface. Fern introduced Miss Buttonface to every person, animal, and significant piece of furniture she encountered with the gravity of someone making important social introductions. The bag Eleanor carried was small. What was in it was smaller still. Two changes of clothing for each of them, the Bible that had been her mother's, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of undyed wool, the diary. She had tied the bag shut with a piece of red thread. Not for decoration, the thread was a remnant from her wedding dress, the panel she had removed and sold to a secondhand shop on Chestnut Street the week before she left. She had kept the thread as a reminder. There are things that come apart not because they are worthless, but because you cannot go forward carrying them. She had read the advertisement in a newspaper left on the seat of a city omnibus 3 months after Franklin disappeared. She had read it 3 times. She had folded it and put it in her pocket and gone home and made dinner for 2 small girls and put them to bed, and then sat at the kitchen table with a candle and the newspaper clipping and the knowledge that $37.50 was not going to sustain 3 people through another winter in Philadelphia. The part of the advertisement that had stopped her was 4 words long: honest treatment, guaranteed. She had written a letter that same night. She had not mentioned Nell and Fern fully. She had not lied. She had simply failed to describe her situation with complete accuracy, which she recognized was its own kind of dishonesty, but which the circumstances seemed to her to require. And then the night before she was due to board the train west, she had found a note that had been pushed under the door of her boarding room. No stamp, no postmark. Someone had placed it there by hand. The message was short. She had read it once and then read it again and then folded it very carefully and placed it under the diary at the bottom of the bag. It said, "I know where you are going, Ellie. Montana is not far enough." She had boarded the train the next morning at 6 o'clock with Nell on one side and Fern on the other, and Miss Buttonface riding in Fern's arms with the solemn expression of someone embarking on a journey. Eleanor Whitmore had not looked behind her once at the platform, but she had not stopped thinking about that note. The man who drove the freight wagon from Millhaven to the ranch was Gerald Sims, who kept the general store on the main street of town and who had given Eleanor directions and a ride and an honest assessment of the road conditions and the weather in that order, which told her something useful about his priorities. He was a lean man somewhere past 60 with a white mustache and a way of looking at things sideways rather than straight on. That suggested he had arrived at most of his opinions through indirect examination rather than confrontation. He had asked no questions on the drive, but she had caught him looking once at the bag with the red thread and once at Fern, who had spent the entire journey telling Miss Buttonface the names of all the trees they were passing. He had stopped the wagon at the front of the property, helped her and the girls down with a courtesy that seemed to have survived several decades of hard country entirely intact, and said, "I'll wait a spell just in case." She had thanked him and walked to the door with Nell's hand in hers and Fern running ahead because Fern always ran ahead. Now she stood in that doorway. The man who had not been written to stood before her, and his face was doing things she could not fully interpret, and behind him the cabin was warm with firelight and smelled of pine smoke and wood shavings and coffee, and her daughters were cold, and so she was grateful when he stepped back without a word and the door opened wider. Inside, everything was functional and nothing was unnecessary. The main room held a long table of thick lumber, 3 chairs, a cast iron stove that occupied the corner with the authority of something that had been solving problems since before anyone currently living could remember. The floor was hewn plank, worn smooth. Above the fireplace, a timber mantelpiece. On the mantelpiece, a small wooden carving and a stopped clock in a smooth oval stone that looked like something a child had carried home from a creek. The carving was of a woman kneeling beside a small child. It had been made by someone who knew grief from the inside. Eleanor looked at it once and then looked away. From the direction of what appeared to be a kitchen, a second man appeared. He was tall, but not so tall as the first, with auburn hair and a smile that arrived on his face and then thought better of itself when it encountered the room's atmosphere. He was holding a wooden spoon and wearing an expression that Eleanor had seen on men before, the expression of a man calculating quickly whether charm can serve or honesty would not. He looked at her. He looked at the girls. He looked at the man who had opened the door. "Caleb," he started. The word the large man said next was quiet. It carried no raised pitch, no heat. It was the quieter kind of dangerous, the kind that does not need volume. "My room, tonight." Then he turned to Eleanor and said in the same controlled tone, "Take the back room. It's small, but it's warm." That was all. He moved to the fireplace and put 2 more logs on, and when he straightened, he did not look at her again. He looked at Fern, who had walked directly to the hearth and was warming her small hands with the matter-of-factness of a person who has decided that warmth is available, and therefore it would be wasteful not to use it. Something moved across his face so quickly Eleanor almost missed it. Then Nell touched her arm and she turned away. The back room was indeed small. A rope bed with a wool mattress, a wool blanket folded at the foot, a window barely larger than a man's chest frosted at the corners. Eleanor sat Fern on the bed and helped her off with her wet shoes and rubbed her feet until Fern declared them acceptable and went immediately to introduce Miss Buttonface to the window. Nell sat beside Eleanor on the edge of the mattress. For a while they did not speak. The sounds of the house moved through the wall, footsteps, a low exchange of voices in the main room, too quiet to hear. Then Nell said, "He didn't know we were coming." "No," Eleanor said, "but he let us in." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes, he did." Nell considered this. "The other one is the one who wrote." "I think so." Nell accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most information. "The big one has sad eyes." Eleanor said nothing to this because there was nothing useful to say, and Nell had not needed her to say anything anyway. Later, after both girls were asleep, Nell curled on one side of the narrow bed with her arms around Fern, who had fallen unconscious mid-sentence about Miss Buttonface's opinion of Montana. Eleanor sat with a small oil lamp and opened the diary. She did not look at the old entries. She turned to the first blank page. The pen scratched against the paper in the cold, quiet room, and she wrote December 3rd, 1874. Hargrove Ranch, Montana Territory. 3 brothers, 2 beds, 1 fire. The man who opened the door did not know I was coming. He made room anyway. I do not know what that means yet. She sat with the pen over the page for another moment. Then she reached into the bottom of the bag, under the Bible, past the wrapped diary she had just been writing, into the folded piece of paper underneath. She unfolded it, read it again, though she already knew every word. "I know where you are going, Ellie. Montana is not far enough." The handwriting was not Franklin's, but the words were his, which meant he was alive, which she had suspected, and it meant he had resources she had not anticipated, which she had feared. She folded the note, placed it back at the bottom of the bag, wrapped the red thread, and held it in her hands for a moment, looking at the knot. Outside, the snow was thickening. She could hear it against the window, soft and steady, the sound of a world slowly going white. She woke before dawn to the sound of something she had not heard in a very long time. Silence. Not the held breath of a house where someone might shout. Not the listening silence. Just the ordinary deep quiet of early morning in a place where nothing was preparing to happen except the slow lightening of the sky. She dressed without waking the girls and found her way down the short hallway to the main room. Caleb Hargrove was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He was looking out the window at the dark. He did not turn when she came in, which meant he had heard her and had decided that acknowledgement was not required, a distinction that she understood immediately and found unexpectedly comfortable. She stood near the stove for a moment, then she put a log on the fire because it needed one. She found a second cup, found the coffee pot, poured. She sat at the table, not at his end. At her own end, 3 chairs down so that they were in the same room without being in the same space. He had not invited her to sit, but he had not objected either. This seemed to be how things worked in this house, and she was beginning to understand it. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. He said, still looking at the window, "Silas didn't tell me." "I know," she said. "I could see that." You have children. 2. Nell is 7. Fern is 4. The letter didn't say that. She kept her voice even. The letter omitted several things. He looked at her then for the first time. The amber eyes held no anger. They held something more complicated than anger. The look of a man calculating the difference between what he expected and what is, and attempting to reconcile them without sufficient information to do either properly. Sit closer, he said. The coffee's better when it's hot. She moved 2 chairs down. He poured her cup fuller. This seemed to be the end of the conversation. It was not. Several minutes later, he said, Silas will explain the bank situation before breakfast. The loan, she said. He looked at her again, slightly more careful this time. He told me what he told you, she said, and I can read between lines. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in the set of his jaw, barely perceptible, the equivalent on a mountain of a pebble settling. Sit at the table for breakfast, he said. There'll be enough. She understood this for what it was. Not a welcome, not a resolution, an acknowledgement that for the time being the situation was what it was, and he was not the kind of man who dealt in what things should have been rather than what they were. Thank you, she said. He did not answer. He looked back at the window, but he did not leave the table. Silas Hargrove sat across from Eleanor after breakfast with his coffee and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation in his head and has just realized that no version of it was adequate. He told her about the debt, the full amount, the timeline. He told her about Homer Banks and the banker's suggestion about settled households and family concerns. He told her that he had placed the advertisement 3 months ago and conducted the correspondence alone, and that the decision had been made, and as he put it, with the well-being of the ranch and its people as the primary concern. You mean Caleb, Eleanor said. I mean all of us. You mean Caleb, she said again. Silas looked at his coffee cup. He's been alone a long time. Has he been asked if he wanted company? He would have said no. Eleanor looked at this man across from her. She understood him in the way you understand a well-meaning mistake, clearly without malice, but also without patience for the same mistake twice. Then the problem with what you did, she said, is not that you wanted something good for your brother. The problem is that you decided what good for him looked like without asking him. Silas met her eyes for a moment. The smile that was always available to him did not come. Yes, he said, that's the problem. The honesty of it surprised her. She had expected deflection. All right, she said, tell me about the numbers. He told her. She listened carefully. She had 3 years of household financial records stored in her memory with the precision of someone who had known that information was a form of protection. And when he was done, she asked 4 questions that told him in the asking of them that she understood the situation better than he might have expected. He said, you know accounting. I kept our household books. My husband was not good with money. Something in the way she said my husband stopped Silas from asking the obvious question. The spring sale is the pivot point, Doris, Eleanor said. If the herd comes through the winter at full count and prices hold above last year's floor, you can make a partial payment that keeps banks satisfied through summer. After summer, you have another decision. But spring is what matters. Silas stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, yes, that's right. Eleanor looked at the small carved figure on the mantel for a moment. Then she looked back at Silas and said, who is Margaret? The name landed in the room differently than most names do. Silas was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. She was engaged to Caleb, he said. She died. The child, too, spring of 1869. He looked at the carving. Eleanor followed his eyes. He made that the night she died, Silas said. He hasn't moved it since. Eleanor looked at the small kneeling figure for a moment, at the roughness of the cut, at the care, despite the roughness, at the stopped clock beside it, at the small oval stone. She looked away. Thank you, she said, for telling me. The conversation ended there, but the information it had given her was something she carried with her for the rest of the day, careful with it the way you are careful with things that belong to someone else. She met Drum Hargrove properly that afternoon. He came in from fence work and with cold on him still, and mud on his boots, and the particular set of a 25-year-old's jaw that she had come to understand meant a decision had already been made. He looked at her from across the main room with gray eyes that were doing several things at once, none of which he bothered to conceal. She was in the process of moving the winter food stores from a disorganized pile near the back door to a more systematic arrangement organized by approximate expiry, because she had seen in the first half hour of daylight that the current method was going to result in spoiled stores before February. Drum looked at what she was doing. He looked at her. He said, "Leave that." "It needs organizing," she said. "You'll lose a third of these before spring otherwise. We've managed without your opinions on our stores." She met his eyes, not with anger, with steadiness. "I'm not offering an opinion. I'm doing a task that needs doing. You're not staying long enough to matter what you do." She finished placing a jar of preserved beans on the shelf where it belonged, straightened, and looked at him again with the full patience of someone who has been spoken to far more harshly than this and is neither injured nor interested in a fight. "If I'm here until spring," she said, "that's long enough to prevent food spoilage. If I'm here longer, you'll be glad of the organization. Either way, this work needs doing." She paused. "You're welcome to help." Drum stared at her for a long moment. She held the look without blinking. Then he made a sound that was not quite anything and went back outside. She finished the stores. That evening at dinner, the four of them ate in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile. Fern had climbed into the chair beside Caleb with the directness of someone who has assessed the available seating and made the obvious choice. Caleb looked down at her, then at the table in front of her, then at Eleanor with a question that was more a statement. "She picks her own chair," Eleanor said. Caleb looked at Fern. Fern was explaining to Miss Buttonface in a low, serious voice that Montana was cold, but the fire was good, and the big man next to them was warm. After a moment, Caleb picked up his fork. Drum ate without looking at anyone. Silas made one attempt at conversation and abandoned it. Nell ate with quiet efficiency and observed everything. Afterward, after the dishes were done and Silas had gone to check the barn and Drum had disappeared outside, Eleanor sat near the fire mending a tear she had found in one of the curtains. It was not her curtain. She had not been asked. The tear was there and needle and thread were in her bag because she kept needle and thread in her bag the way she kept the diary, because both were tools that had proven necessary more than once and might prove necessary again. Caleb sat in the chair near the window with a piece of harness leather and a punch, working with the slow regularity of a man who has learned to make his hands useful in the evenings, because the evenings are long and stillness is not always a friend. They did not speak, but neither of them moved away. And the fire between them was the same fire, and the room was the same room, and something in that shared space had a quality different from the silence of the morning. Less careful, more accustomed the way two people begin to occupy the same air. Fern had fallen asleep on the rug before the fire with Miss Buttonface under her arm, having exhausted herself in the course of explaining Montana to the doll. Caleb looked at the child once and then looked away, and his face did the thing it did when it thought no one was watching, which was a thing Eleanor was beginning to suspect very few people had ever seen. She finished the curtain and folded it and set it aside. He was still working on the leather when she said goodnight. He nodded once without looking up. She woke in the night sometime past midnight to the silence of the house and the sound outside of what might have been a coyote. She lay in the dark for a moment with Nell and Fern asleep on either side of her, and the note from Franklin at the bottom of her bag under the bed and the stop clock on the mantelpiece in the other room ticking nothing. Through the wall, she heard nothing, but under the door, a thread of light. He was still up, still working, or simply sitting, still awake in the way of a man who has learned that sleep does not always come when invited and has stopped expecting it to. She lay in the darkness and she thought about what Silas had said about the carved figure and the night it was made. She thought about a man standing outside a closed door with his hands at his sides and nowhere for the grief to go. She thought about 5 years of winters in this house after that night. She thought that is a very long time to be alone with something you can't put down. She did not think about Franklin. Not then. She would think about him soon enough. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence, in the faint sound of what she was increasingly sure was the slow, careful sound of a man working with his hands in the room next door, because his hands were the only part of him that still knew what to do. The lamp under the door burned until dawn. On the fourth morning, Nell asked to help with breakfast and was given the job of stirring the cornmeal, which she approached with the methodical seriousness she brought to everything. Fern woke up, ran immediately to the mantelpiece, and stood before the carved figure with Miss Buttonface held up to look at it. "Who are they?" Fern asked. Silas, who had been nearest, opened his mouth. Caleb came through the door from outside at that moment, and Silas closed it again. Fern turned and asked the question again, with perfect directness to the person she had decided was the most appropriate source. "Who are they?" She pointed at the carving. Caleb looked at the small figure for a moment. Then he looked at Fern. "Someone who used to live here," he said. "Where did they go?" He was quiet for just long enough that Nell looked up from the cornmeal. "They went away forever," he said. Fern considered this with the seriousness of 4 years old. Then she looked at Miss Buttonface and appeared to convey the information to the doll with a small series of nods. Then she turned back to the room with the expression of someone who has processed a piece of information and is now ready to move on to the next thing. "Miss Buttonface thinks they would have liked Montana," she said. The table was very quiet. Caleb put 2 more logs on the fire. He said nothing. But when he sat down to breakfast, he did not look at the carving, which was different from how he had been sitting before, and Eleanor noticed it and said nothing. After the meal, after Silas had gone to the barn, and Drum had gone back to the fence, and Nell had gone to sit near the window with the Bible trying to sound out the longer words, Eleanor washed the dishes. Caleb remained at the table working on the same piece of harness from the night before. Without looking up from the stitching, he said, "There are stores that need moving from the north side of the barn. Too heavy for you alone." "I'll come when I'm finished here," she said. He nodded once. When she had dried the last bowl, she picked up her coat and followed him out into the cold white morning, and there was something in the way she did it without hesitation, without performing gratitude, that she would not have been able to explain, except to say that for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she was not walking towards something because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. She was walking toward it because she chose to. That distinction was not a small thing. In the barn, Caleb moved the heavy crates with the patient economy of a man who does not waste effort. Eleanor worked alongside him without speaking. Miss Buttonface watched from a windowsill where Fern had placed her with instructions to guard the barn while people were working. Halfway through the task, Caleb stopped and looked at the doll. He looked at it for a long moment, the blank cloth face with its absent eyes, the small, serious figure propped against the cold window frame. He did not say anything. He went back to work. But when they left the barn an hour later, someone had set a small piece of folded blue cloth beside Miss Buttonface on the windowsill. Not quite a scarf, folded into a rough triangle the size of something that might fit around the neck of a doll with no eyes. No one in the house had asked him to do it. No one mentioned it at dinner. But Eleanor saw it when she collected Fern from the barn that evening, and she stood with it in her hand for a moment in the cold, and she thought, this is how it begins. Not with words, not with declarations, with a piece of blue cloth folded beside a blind doll on a cold windowsill. The lamp was burning under his door again when she finally slept. The first week passed the way hard weather passes, not quickly, not easily, but with the particular momentum of something that simply will not stop, regardless of how you feel about it. There was no formal agreement, no terms negotiated at the table, no arrangement spoken aloud in the careful language of people who are uncertain of their ground. What happened instead was smaller and more durable than any spoken arrangement. It was the accumulation of mornings, the way a household finds its rhythm, not through intention, but through repetition, through the slow sedimentation of one ordinary day on top of another, until something like routine exists without anyone having decided to build it. Eleanor was awake before the house each morning. This had been true in Philadelphia, and it was true here, but the reasons were different now in a way that took her several days to recognize. In Philadelphia, she had woken early out of vigilance with the alertness of someone whose nights had too often been interrupted by something she had learned not to name. Here she woke early because the morning was quiet, and the quiet was simply quiet. No particular dread lived in it. That absence, which should have been ordinary, felt instead like the first drink of clean water after a long time without. She lit the stove. She put water on. She worked with the provision she found and supplemented as needed from what she was learning about the patterns of the kitchen, which told its own story about the men who had been feeding themselves from it without anyone to impose order on the chaos. Caleb came down next, always. The amber eyes already open and clear in the way of a man who does not drift between sleeping and waking, but simply arrives at consciousness and proceeds. He accepted the coffee that appeared before him without ceremony and sat with it at the window in the particular stillness she was beginning to recognize as his native state. Not absence, not indifference, but the composure of a man who has found that most things that require doing do not require talking about. Silas appeared third with his auburn hair, carrying the evidence of sleep, and his expression carrying the evidence of a man who was actively attempting to demonstrate good faith through cheerfulness. She appreciated the effort even when it missed. Drum came last or not at all, having sometimes already been outside in the gray pre-dawn, doing something that apparently could not wait until the sun confirmed that morning had actually arrived. He ate without conversation, and he went back out, and he did not look at her more than courtesy required, which at least had the quality of consistency. She worked, not because it was required of her in any explicit sense, because the work existed and her hands were available, and standing still in a house where everyone around her was in constant motion seemed to her both wasteful and somehow dishonest, a performance of helplessness she had no interest in giving. She reorganized the winter food stores on the first proper day, a task that Drum had objected to, and then silently used the results of before the week was out. She repaired the curtain she had noticed on the first evening. She mended a tear in one of Drum's work shirts that she found folded on the pile near the back door, and she left it there without mentioning it, and it disappeared from the pile the next morning, still without mention. Nell attached herself to Silas during those first days with the quiet persistence of a child who has identified the most informative available source and intends to make use of it. Silas, to his considerable credit, handled this with good humor and no condescension. He taught her the names of the horses. He explained the fence line system and why certain sections were higher than others. He showed her how to read the sky for incoming weather, pointing out the particular quality of cloud formation over the ridge that meant snow within 6 hours. Nell absorbed all of it with the grave attention of someone who understands that knowledge is not ornamental. Fern, by the end of day 3, had named 11 cattle and was working on the rest. Drum, who was responsible for the cattle, found himself in the position of a man who either accepts that his livestock now have names or engages in an argument with a 4-year-old about the nature of bovine identity. He chose the former with a silence that was not quite surrender. Miss Buttonface had been introduced to every chair in the main room. Both horses by name, 3 fence posts that Fern had decided had distinguishing characteristics in the carved figure on the mantelpiece to which Fern had made the formal introduction. This is Miss Buttonface. She doesn't have eyes, but she notices things. Whatever Caleb made of this observation, he kept to himself. On the 7th morning, Nell came down to breakfast and put the old Bible on the table and opened it to a page in the middle and sat waiting. When Caleb sat down with his coffee, she pushed the book across the table and pointed to the first line of the passage and looked at him. He looked at the book. He looked at the child. He looked at the book again. "Read," he said. She read, slowly sounding out the difficult words with the serious application of someone who has decided that the task is worth the effort regardless of how long it takes. When she stumbled, Caleb said the word. Just the word, nothing added, no encouragement that would have qualified as pressure. She went on. They read for nearly 20 minutes. Eleanor at the stove with her back to them listened to her daughter's careful voice, and to the deep, quiet one that intervened when needed, and she did not turn around. Some things require privacy to be real. On the 10th day, she went to the woodpile behind the barn. She had looked at that woodpile every day since arriving and done the arithmetic that any sensible person does when winter is long and the supply is finite. The arithmetic said more cutting was needed. She found the axe propped against the splitting stump, a broad-headed tool with a hickory handle worn to the dark color of long use, and she picked it up. She knew immediately that the grip was wrong. 3 years of a husband who kept her indoors had not prepared her hands for the particular mechanics of the thing. The weight distributed itself badly, and she could feel before she had taken a single swing that the attempt was going to produce nothing useful and possibly something painful. She swung anyway. The blade skated off the corner of the log and buried itself in the frozen ground to the left. She tried again. Better, but not much. She was setting the next log when the shadow came over her shoulder. He did not announce himself. He was simply there the way weather is simply there present, without having arrived part of the landscape, without effort. She felt the change in the air before she registered him behind her, the particular displacement of cold that a large, warm thing creates when it gets close. His hands came around from behind and adjusted her grip with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man correcting a tool problem rather than touching a person. Right hand moved down the handle 2 inches, left thumb repositioned. The adjustment was over before she had fully processed that it had begun. She flinched, not from pain, not from him, from something much older than this morning, something that lived in the body's memory, below the reach of conscious instruction, the involuntary contraction of a person who has learned that closeness and discomfort share an address. He stepped back immediately. 2 full steps. "I'm sorry," he said. "No," she said, turning to face him, needing him to understand the correction. "It wasn't you. It was a reflex, an old one." He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with the full, quiet attention of someone who does not rush to conclusions and does not look away. His expression was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who understands that some kind of damage are not visible from the outside and requires no explanation. He said nothing. He stepped back to his original position a full arm's length away and said, "The cut goes straight down with the weight. Let the head do the work, not your arms." He did not touch her again. He stood at his distance and talked her through it, one instruction at a time, and on the third attempt the log came apart cleanly and the 2 halves fell to either side of the stump with the satisfying weight of a thing done correctly. She swung again and again. They worked beside each other without speaking, him taking the larger rounds and her the smaller, and the pile behind them grew in the clean, cold air, and the sound of the axe was steady and purposeful, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill space with reassurance and have begun to occupy the same ground without performance. When they were done, she did not thank him with words. She set the axe back against the stump in the place she had found it and walked back toward the house with wood enough for 3 days under one arm. He watched her go. She did not look back, but she knew he watched the same way. You know certain things about weather without being told by the quality of the air and the direction of the wind and the particular texture of a silence that has something in it. That evening she wrote in her diary, "He fixed my hands without asking why they were broken." She stared at the sentence for a long time. Then she closed the book. It was Nell who brought Margaret back into the room, not through carelessness. Nell was never careless. She did it the way she did everything, with deliberate care and an assessment of timing that was remarkable in a 7-year-old. She had been watching Caleb for 10 days with those dark, attentive eyes, and she had drawn her own conclusions, and she had decided that the question she was carrying deserved to be asked directly and to the correct person. She was dusting the mantelpiece, a task she had assigned to herself without being asked, when she picked up the carved figure and brought it to where Caleb sat working on a length of harness in the afternoon light. She set the figure on the table in front of him. She waited. "Who are they?" she said. The work in his hand stopped. Nell did not repeat herself. She had already asked the question. She stood and waited with the patience of someone who understands that some questions require time to answer, not because the person does not know the answer, but because the answer costs something. Someone who used to live here, he said. Did they go away or go away forever? The second way of asking this was Nell's own invention, the product of having grown up in a house where the difference between absence and permanent absence was something she had navigated alone because no one had explained it to her properly. Forever, he said. She absorbed this. She picked the figure up, wiped the surface with the cloth she was holding, and placed it back on the mantelpiece with the precision of someone returning something to its right position. Then she went back to her work. Caleb sat with the harness in his hands and did not move it for several minutes. That evening, when Silas had gone to check the fence on the south boundary and Drum had disappeared into the kind of solitude he preferred. After dinner, Caleb took the carved figure down from the mantelpiece himself and set it on the table. Eleanor was at the table sewing. She looked at the figure. She looked at him. He sat. He was quiet for a while in the way that was his way, gathering something or deciding something, she could not always tell which. Margaret Ann Clare, he said. She was 20 years old. The baby didn't make it either. That was the spring of 1869. Eleanor did not speak, did not offer the platitudes that exist for moments like this and that she had always found worse than silence. I kept it because I didn't want to behave as though they were never here, he said. Some people seem to think that continuing to live means you leave the dead behind. I never believed that. You don't have to, she said. I know. He looked at the small kneeling figure. She would have found the situation we're currently in very funny. Margaret had a sense of humor about things that most people took seriously. She would have appreciated what Silas did even while she told him exactly what she thought of it. It was the most he had said at one time since she arrived. Eleanor looked at the carving, at the rough cuts in the wood, at the care visible in that roughness, at the stopped clock nearby in the smooth creek stone. She would have liked Nell, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Yes, he said, she would have. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, the stone was hers. She carried it from a creek on her family's property. She used to say it was the one piece of Montana that had been worn smooth enough to be pleasant company. Eleanor looked at the oval stone on the mantelpiece. She thought about a woman she had never met and a man sitting through a night with an axe and a block of pine and a grief too large for silence. Caleb, she said. He waited. She would have been glad you kept them. He did not answer. He put the carved figure back on the mantelpiece, and he picked up his harness work, and the evening continued with the fire settling and the wind outside doing what wind does in Montana in December, which is remind you constantly that the walls between you and the outside world are exactly as thin as they are and not a fiber thinner. Drum came back to something that was not quite civil after Fern named the last of the cattle. The naming had concluded one afternoon with considerable ceremony. 23 cattle, all named a process that had taken most of a week and involved Miss Buttonface as a witness to several of the more significant decisions. Fern stood in the middle of the field with her boots in the mud left by the thaw on the south side and announced to Drum, who had been present for the final 7 namings against his stated preferences, that the work was complete. Drum had looked at the cattle. He had looked at the child. He had looked up at the sky in the manner of a man seeking patience from a source that had not historically been generous with it. Then Fern had reached up and taken his hand without warning or preamble, the way she took everything she needed and said, now they have names, now they're safe. The logic of this and the absolute certainty with which it was delivered seemed to land somewhere in Drum Hargrove that his defenses had not expected to need protecting. He said nothing, but he did not shake her off. That night at dinner, he put an extra portion on Fern's plate without being asked and retreated back behind the wall of his silence, before anyone could make something of it. Eleanor noticed. She said nothing. Some progress is better witnessed in silence. The evening she told Caleb about Franklin, the fire had burned down to coals and the house was very quiet. Silas had ridden to Millhaven that afternoon for provisions and returned with the smell of cold on him and the expression of a man who had heard something in town that he had not yet decided what to do with. Eleanor had watched that expression across the dinner table and read it with the accuracy of someone who had spent years reading the faces of people who were keeping things from her. After dinner, she stood at the window and looked at the dark. "The banker," she said to the room where Caleb was still at the table. "He told you about a settled household. He suggested it, and Silas acted on the suggestion." "Yes." "But you wouldn't have." He was quiet for a moment. "No." She turned from the window. "I need to tell you something." He set down what he was working on. He waited with the full presence he brought to things that mattered. She told him about Franklin. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but the shape of it, the years of the ledger, the debts, the disappearance in April, the official account of the accident in the body that was never found, the note that had been pushed under her door the night before she left Philadelphia, the handwriting that was not Franklin's, but the words that were. He listened without interrupting. "He's alive," she said. "I don't know where, but he's alive, and he knows I came here." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of someone who does not know what to say, but the silence of someone taking information in fully before speaking. "His full name," he said, "Franklin Whitmore. He's 34 years old, medium height, ordinary looking. The kind of face you'd forget in a crowd." "What does he want?" "I don't know exactly. What men like him usually want is not the thing itself, but the fact that it belongs to them." He looked at her for a long time. "You have a record," he said. She understood that he had heard the accounting quality in her description. "I have a diary, 3 years of dates and figures and facts. I kept it the way you keep a ledger because I understood early that information is the only form of protection that can't be taken from you with a locked door." "Where is it?" "Bottom of my bag." He nodded once. The nod carried something heavier than acknowledgement. It carried a kind of reckoning, the look of a man absorbing a change in the dimensions of a problem he had thought he understood. "Why are you telling me now?" he said. "Because I'm in your house. And if he comes looking here, you have the right to know before he arrives." He was quiet for a long moment. "Where does he think you are legally?" He said, "Widowed." He let the official account stand for almost a year. That was a mistake on his part. If he surfaces, now claiming to be alive, he has to explain where he was during the year that he was dead. He was running from a debt, a significant one, contracted in April of 1874 and due the week the accident happened. Something moved in Caleb's expression, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "You have dates," he said. "I have dates and amounts in names. The company he owed was Green Brothers Shipping. I know the contracted amount in the interest rate and the date of the note." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "Get some sleep." She went to the doorway. Then she stopped. "Caleb," he waited. "Thank you for not telling me it's nothing to worry about." "It's not nothing," he said, "but it's not yours to carry alone anymore." She went to bed. The lamp under his door burned until later than usual, and she lay in the dark and thought about a man sitting at a table with a set of facts she had just given him, turning them over in the way of someone building something, and she felt in a way she had not felt in years and would not have known how to name, even now that the weight had distributed itself differently on her shoulders. Not lighter but less solitary, which was its own kind of relief. 3 days later, Gerald Sims sent word from Millhaven. He sent it the way things got sent in small frontier towns through the boy who drove the twice-weekly supply cart folded into the delivery receipt with no explanation on the outside. The note was brief in the manner of a man who understood that brevity was its own kind of clarity. It said, "There's a man in town asking questions about a woman with 2 girls. Arrived 3 days ago, stays at the boarding house. Wears city clothes. Doesn't talk much, but listens well. Thought you should know." Caleb read the note twice. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He told Silas to stay at the ranch. He saddled his horse without particular hurry, and he rode into Millhaven alone. The boarding house was on the main street, 2 stories of whitewashed lumber that represented the town's ambitions more than its reality. The owner ran a dining room on the ground floor and rented 3 rooms above it. Franklin Whitmore was in the dining room when Caleb walked in. He was exactly as Eleanor had described him, ordinary in every dimension. The face that would vanish from memory as soon as you looked away, the clothing slightly too polished for the territory, the hands that had not done the kind of work that marked a man's hands here. He was reading a newspaper and drinking tea, which in itself marked him as someone who had not spent much time west of the Missouri. He looked up when Caleb came in. Caleb pulled out the chair opposite him and sat without being invited. He put his hat on the table. He looked at the man the way he looked at weather that needed assessing before it became a problem. Franklin Whitmore held the look with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned that composure was its own kind of armor. "Franklin Whitmore," Caleb said. It was not a question. "That's right," Whitmore said, "and you would be the person you're going to speak to if you intend to continue asking questions in this town." Whitmore set down the newspaper. He studied Caleb with eyes that were quick and calculating behind their calm surface. "I'm looking for my wife," he said. "That's a lawful thing for a man to do." "Your wife believes you're dead." "A misunderstanding. I recovered from the accident at some distance from Philadelphia. When I returned, she was gone." "Recovered from the accident," Caleb said. "The accident that happened the same week your note to the Green Brothers Shipping Company was due." The pause that followed was brief, but it was there. "I'm not familiar with what you're referring to," Whitmore said. "You will be," Caleb said, "if this goes further." He let that sit. He watched the calculation behind Whitmore's eyes work through the available options. "She has my children," Whitmore said. "She has her children," Caleb said, "who are well and warm and fed." "Under what legal arrangement exactly?" "Under the arrangement that she arrived here, she is welcome here, and if you approach that property or those children, the questions that will be asked about your whereabouts during the year you were officially deceased will be asked loudly and in front of a territorial judge." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at the newspaper. He looked at his tea. "You don't have the legal standing to make that threat," he said. "You're right," Caleb said. "I don't. But Amos Parker does, and he's the territorial judge in Helena, and he went to school with Homer Banks, who is the man who holds the note on my property and who does not appreciate complications in his territory." He stood and picked up his hat. "Amos Parker is also a man who dislikes waste, and a man who faked his own death to avoid a debt is, in Amos Parker's view, a very significant waste of the court's time." He put his hat on. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about your next step," he said, "and I'd encourage you to think about it somewhere other than Millhaven." He walked out. On the ride back in the cold that pressed down off the mountains like a permanent announcement, Caleb thought about the information Eleanor kept in a diary at the bottom of her bag, and the date of a shipping note in the week of an accident, and the particular arithmetic of a man who had spent a year being officially dead. He thought she has been carrying this alone for a long time. He pushed the horse a little faster into the wind. Silas was waiting at the gate when he came back. This was unusual. Silas did not wait for people at gates. Silas was generally in motion or strategically positioned where the motion was happening. He handed over the 3 letters without preamble, which was also unusual for Silas, who was a man who generally preferred to frame things before delivering them. 3 envelopes, all addressed to E. Hargrove, all from a law firm in Philadelphia. The first was polite. It requested information regarding the current whereabouts of one Eleanor Whitmore and described the inquiry as a family matter. The second was firmer. It described the matter as a legal one and suggested that failure to respond would be taken as indication of active interference. The third was short. It said, "Only we know she has gone to Montana. We know the address of the property. We inform you in advance." That third letter had arrived the day before Eleanor did. "I burned it," Silas said. "I thought if Caleb read it, he would send them away before they got here. I thought it would be fine." Caleb looked at the letters in his hands for a long moment. It was not fine, he said. No, Silas said. It was not. He was quiet again in the manner of a man who is waiting for a consequence. The next time, Caleb said, before you decide what I should know, tell me and let me decide. Silas said yes with the solemnity of someone who has understood something that matters. Caleb went inside and found Eleanor in the kitchen and placed the 3 letters on the table in front of her and told her what Silas had found in town. She looked at the letters. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for a shape of thing to appear and has now seen what shape it turned out to be. He's not going to stop, she said. No, Caleb said, but he has a problem. He told her about the conversation in the dining room about the judge and Helena, about what he had said regarding the debt and the timing of the accident. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you can't threaten him with facts you don't have documented. You have them documented, he said. She looked at him. The diary, he said. She was very still for a moment. If it came to a judge, he said those entries would be evidence. Dates, amounts, names. The kind of record that a court takes seriously because it was kept before anyone knew it would be needed. He'll say I fabricated it. Let him. 3 years of consistent daily entries in the same hand, in the same ink, with dates that can be corroborated against public records. That's not something a person fabricates after the fact. He paused. And a man who disappeared to avoid a debt and is now surfacing a year later to claim his wife does not present well to a territorial judge, regardless of what papers he carries. Eleanor looked at the 3 letters on the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about the weight of what she had been carrying in the bottom of that bag and the strange fact of having put it down, if only in description, on the table in front of someone else. He'll come to the ranch, she said. Yes. He'll bring someone legal with him. Probably. And you would stand there and let me handle it. He looked at her steadily. I would stand there and let you handle what is yours to handle, and I would be standing there. She looked at him for a long moment. That's different from how I'm used to things working, she said. I know, he said. He came on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the hard blue of a Montana winter, finally breaking towards something that might eventually be called spring. Franklin Whitmore did not come alone. He brought with him a man named Holt, a deputy federal marshal from Helena, with the particular air of a man who has been asked to do an uncomfortable thing and has decided that discomfort is a professional hazard rather than a reason to refuse. Deputy Holt was tall and gray-bearded and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who preferred not to be called upon to use anything other than his voice, but who was quite prepared to use more if circumstances required. They appeared at the gate while Caleb was splitting wood in the yard, and Silas was working on the fence nearest the barn, and Drum was in the cattle pasture on the east side. Eleanor was in the kitchen. Nell was at the table with the Bible. Fern was somewhere in the barn, explaining something to the horses. Caleb saw them from 40 yards and straightened and set the axe against the stump without hurrying and walked to the gate. He did not open it. Holt introduced himself and produced papers from a leather case. The papers were genuine. He had the look of a man who always carried genuine papers. There is a legal claim of marriage. Holt said it with the regret of a man who would personally prefer to be elsewhere. Mr. Whitmore has standing, and I've been asked to ensure he has the opportunity to speak with his family. Caleb looked at the papers. He looked at Franklin Whitmore, who was standing just behind Holt with his ordinary face arranged into an expression of patient reasonableness that cost him nothing and communicated nothing true. I'll need a moment, Caleb said. He walked to the house. He opened the kitchen door and stood in the doorway. Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen. She had known. The quality of the morning had told her something was coming even before she heard the horses. She stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on its surface and her back very straight, and her face carrying the composed stillness of someone who has been preparing for this for longer than the last 2 days. He's at the gate, Caleb said. He has a deputy marshal with him and legal papers. I know, she said. Do you want me to come with you? She looked at him. She thought about what he had said about standing there, about what was hers to handle. Stand where I can see you, she said. She took off her apron. She walked to the back room and she opened the bag, and she took out the diary wrapped in its piece of undyed wool, and she held it in her hands for a moment with the particular expression of someone holding something that has been both a burden and a shield and is preparing to use it as the latter for the last time. She walked out into the cold morning air and she crossed the yard to the gate. Drum had appeared at the fence corner on the east side. He said nothing. He stood there. Silas had straightened from his fence work and was standing with his hand on the post, not approaching, simply present. Caleb was to her left, far enough back to give her the space she had asked for, close enough that the size of him was visible to everyone at the gate. Franklin Whitmore looked at her across the gate with the expression she had spent 4 years learning to read and had finally understood. The expression of a man who had decided a long time ago that other people were primarily the means by which he navigated the world, and who was now reassessing the conditions of his navigation. Ellie, he said, and made her name sound like something he owned. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Not Ellie, not Franklin. Mr. Whitmore, in the tone of someone addressing a matter of business. Deputy Holt presented the marriage certificate. She looked at it. She did not take it. That certificate is legal, she said. If the marriage it records is legal, and the legality of a marriage requires both parties to have entered it in good faith. She paused. My husband contracted a note with the Green Brothers Shipping Company of Philadelphia in April of 1874 in the amount of $240 at 15% monthly interest due on May 9th. The accident at the factory occurred on May 7th, 2 days before the note was due, a note he did not tell me he had signed. Whitmore's expression did not change. It never did. That was one of the things she had learned about him. I kept a diary, she said. Daily entries for 3 years. The date of that note, the date of the accident, the dates of other debts he concealed from me with amounts and creditor names. The dates of other things that occurred in our household that I recorded because I was taught by someone who loved me that facts matter and should be written down. She held up the small wrapped book. A man who faked his death to escape a debt and spent a year being officially deceased does not have an uncomplicated legal claim on a wife who believed herself widowed. She looked at Deputy Holt, not at Franklin. I am prepared to submit this diary to a territorial court, she said. I am prepared to request that the court examine the circumstances of my husband's disappearance against the public record of his outstanding debts. I am prepared to do this through any attorney this court recommends. She paused. I am also prepared to be entirely cooperative with any legal process that treats the facts of this matter as the central question rather than the assumptions. Deputy Holt looked at the wrapped diary in her hands. He looked at Franklin Whitmore. Franklin was very still. Holt said carefully, Mr. Whitmore, if there are questions of legal standing regarding the circumstances of your absence, those questions would need to be resolved before this claim could proceed. Franklin said nothing. I would suggest, Holt continued with the deliberate neutrality of a man choosing his terrain carefully, that you consult with your own legal counsel regarding the appropriate next steps. He closed the leather case. Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. I was operating on the information I was given. I understand, she said. You were doing your job. He tipped his hat. He looked at Franklin Whitmore with an expression that contained beneath its professional surface a very small and very precisely measured quantity of judgment. Then he turned his horse and waited. Franklin looked at Eleanor across the gate in the hard blue morning. He looked at the book in her hands. He looked at the yard behind her, at the two men standing at respectful distances in the particular way of men who are ready but have been asked to wait. His ordinary face arranged itself into the expression of a man making a calculation. This isn't finished, he said. Yes, Eleanor said, it is. She held his eyes until he turned away. She heard the horses move. She did not watch them go. She turned back toward the house and walked across the frozen yard with the diary held against her chest and the red thread bag over her shoulder and her chin at the level it had been at since she stepped off the freight wagon 3 weeks ago, which was to say, level. Drum was at the gate behind her, closing it. Silas had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the road with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something that has reorganized several of his assumptions. Caleb was where he had been, to her left, where she could see him. She looked at him as she passed. "It's not finished," she said quietly. "He means what he said." "I know," he said. "He'll come back with different papers." "Probably." She paused, looked at the diary in her hands. "Then we should probably talk to a lawyer." "I know someone in Helena," he said. She nodded. She went inside. Behind her in the yard, Drum looked at Silas with gray eyes that had something in them that had not been there a week ago when he watched the woman in the navy blue dress step off a freight wagon and stand in the snow. Silas looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. But the look between them understood something that they had both separately arrived at, which was that the woman who had just stood at their gate and held her ground against the man she had run from was not someone anyone in this house was going to stop protecting. Not Silas, who had started this whole improbable chain of events with a letter and a pen and the best intentions he could not quite execute honestly. Not Drum, who had buried his objection somewhere under the name of a cow called Bessie, and not Caleb, who stood alone at the fence for a while after everyone else had gone inside, his hand on the post, looking at the road that had brought her here and thinking about the particular shape of courage in a woman who carries a 3-year diary in the bottom of a bag and stands in a Montana morning and says, "Yes, it is finished." Winter always ends, his father used to say. He had not believed it for a long time. He was beginning to believe it again. The night after Franklin Whitmore rode away from the gate, Caleb did not go to bed. This was not unusual. He had spent more nights awake in the past 5 years than he had spent sleeping through them, and the insomnia had long since stopped being something he fought and had become instead a condition. He managed a room he inhabited after the rest of the house had gone quiet with the fire and his hands and whatever work they could find. But that night was different in texture from the others. He sat in the workshop with a piece of pine on the bench and his hands on it, and he tried to identify what was different and could not do it precisely, which was itself unusual. Caleb Hargrove had always been a man who could name his own states. He had learned it as a form of survival in the years when grief can masquerade as so many other things, and the misidentification costs you months or sometimes years before you correct it. What he felt now was not grief. It was not fear, though the morning at the gate had contained elements that could have produced it. It was not the particular heaviness that had lived in the walls of this house since the spring of 1869, and that he had grown so accustomed to carrying that he sometimes forgot it was there until something in the air shifted and he felt the weight of it freshly. He picked up the carving knife. He did not have a plan. He had learned in the worst night of his life that the hands sometimes know what they are making before the mind catches up, and so he simply let them work. The pine was soft, and the knife was sharp, and the shavings fell to the bench in small, pale curls, and after an hour what was taking shape was not a figure. It was a building, a small one barely larger than his fist, with a pitched roof and a square window in the front face, and a door that was only suggested by 2 lines in the wood, but was unmistakably a door. He held it up in the lamplight. It was rough. Everything he made under these conditions was rough. But the roughness had its own quality, the evidence of hands doing something that mattered to them, which was different from the evidence of hands doing something they had been asked to do. He thought about the woman who was asleep in the back room of his house. He thought about the way she had stood at the gate that morning with her back straight and the diary wrapped in its piece of wool held against her chest like something both precious and necessary. He thought about the way she had said the word finished, not as a hope or a declaration, but as a fact, the way you state a fact when you have already done the work that makes it true. He thought about the carving on the mantelpiece and the 5 years of mornings he had sat alone at that table in the particular silence of a house where no one is coming down the hallway behind you. He put the small carved house on the bench beside the lamp, and he sat with it for a long time. Then he folded a small piece of paper, wrote 2 lines on it, and set it in the carving on the kitchen table where she would find them in the morning. He went to bed before dawn for the first time in longer than he could remember. He slept, She found them when she came down in the early gray light. The carved house sat on the table beside the coffee pot. The note beside it said, "For the mantle, if you want." And below that, a single initial. Eleanor picked up the small figure and held it in both hands. It was the size of something you could close your fingers around and keep safe. The roof was slightly uneven. One wall was a fraction thicker than the other. The window was not quite square. These were not the imperfections of carelessness. They were the imperfections of something made in the dark by someone working from the inside of a feeling rather than the outside of a plan. She carried it to the mantelpiece. She set it to the left of the kneeling figure, the woman and the child, so that the two pieces stood side by side on the same shelf. She stepped back and looked at them. One was an elegy, one was something else. She did not move either of them. Fern came down 20 minutes later, at a full run, stopped in front of the mantelpiece with the abrupt halt of someone who has noticed a significant development, and stood with Miss Buttonface held up to observe the new arrival. "Mama," she said, "and there's a house." "I see it," Eleanor said. "Whose house is it?" "I think it's ours," Eleanor said. Fern appeared to relay this information to Miss Buttonface with a series of small nods. Then she turned back with the expression of someone who has processed new information and is ready to move on. "Miss Buttonface thinks that's correct," she said. Caleb's approach to the matter of Franklin Whitmore's legal standing was methodical in a way that Eleanor recognized as fundamentally his, which was to say, he assembled facts before he moved, and he moved once, and he moved in a direction that did not require doubling back. He sent a letter to a man named Clarence Webb in Helena, who was an attorney he had met twice in his father's time and whose reputation in territorial legal circles was one of precision and a marked personal distaste for dishonesty. He enclosed a summary of the situation not written by him, but dictated to Silas, who had the cleaner hand, and at the end, he enclosed a note in his own writing that said, "Only the woman has a diary with 3 years of daily entries. I have looked at a portion of it. The documentation is thorough." He also called on Homer Banks. This visit was not about the debt, or not primarily. Banks received him in the office with the practiced good manners of a man who understands that the large calm ones are often more dangerous than the loud ones. Caleb told him about Franklin Whitmore. He told him what Whitmore had come to the gate with and what Eleanor had said to the deputy marshal, and what the deputy marshal had done with the information. He told Banks about the debt and the dates with the specificity of someone who had been given those numbers by a woman who remembered them exactly. Banks listened. He consulted his pocket watch once more from habit than urgency, and then he forgot to put it away and left it open on the desk, which Caleb took as a sign that the man's attention was genuinely engaged. "Parker will want the diary," Banks said. "He'll have it if it comes to that." Banks looked at the watch face for a moment. "The woman," he said, "she's staying at the property." "Yes." "On what arrangement?" Caleb looked at him steadily. "On the arrangement that she arrived here, she is welcome here, and what happens next is not a condition of your loan." Banks met his eyes. A long moment passed between them in which a number of things were communicated without the inconvenience of language. "The loan," Banks said, "is what it is. The terms are what they are. What happens in your house is not my business, Caleb. I want that understood." "Good," Caleb said. "What I want," Banks said with the careful delivery of a man who has reached the actual point after sufficient preamble, "is the note serviced on schedule. The rest is yours." Caleb stood. He picked up his hat. "Then we understand each other." He rode back through the cold, with the wind off the ridge pressing against him, and the landscape spread out under the hard blue sky in all its indifferent beauty. And he thought about Eleanor standing at the gate with a book pressed to her chest and her chin level, and the word "finished" delivered with the certainty of someone who is prepared for the question and knows the answer. He thought a man keeps his word. His father had said it so often it had become the air in the rooms of his childhood, invisible and necessary. A man keeps his word not when it is convenient, not when the stakes are low, but specifically and especially when it costs him something. He had made no formal word to Eleanor. There had been no spoken arrangement. But there were 4 spoons on that table every morning now, and someone had taken the curtain down and rehung it without the tear. And there was a house on the mantelpiece next to the kneeling figure, and somebody had carved it in the dark because their hands needed to make something other than an elegy that he thought was his own kind of word, and he intended to keep it. The legal matter resolved with a quiet efficiency that felt almost anticlimactic after the weight of what had preceded it. Clarence Webb wrote back within 2 weeks. His letter to Caleb was brief. His separate letter, which Eleanor read alone at the kitchen table while the girls were outside, was longer and more particular. Webb had made inquiries through a colleague in Philadelphia. The debt to Green Brothers Shipping was documented in public business records, as was its outstanding status. The accident report from the factory included an official notation that the body had not been recovered, which Webb described as legally interesting in a manner that suggested he found it considerably more than interesting. He advised Eleanor to preserve the diary in its current condition. He advised her that a territorial court in Helena would hear a petition challenging the validity of the marriage on grounds of fraudulent abandonment, and that the documentation she held would support such a petition substantially. He advised her finally that Franklin Whitmore's options were not good, and that a man who had faked his death to escape debts and was now attempting to resurface and claim a wife in a different territory was a man who had walked into a situation that required him to explain things he could not explain cleanly. She read the letter twice. She folded it and put it with the diary. She went outside where the light was beginning to carry the different quality of a Montana winter, loosening its grip, not spring, yet not by weeks, but something in the angle of it that was slightly less absolute. Fern was in the yard explaining to Drum, with considerable supporting detail, why one of the cattle on the north side of the pasture was not eating properly. Drum was listening with the full attention of a man who had stopped pretending he was not listening to a 4-year-old about the inner life of his cattle. Eleanor watched them for a moment. She thought about the note at the bottom of her bag and the 3 years of diary entries and the fact that those things had been weapons for so long that she had almost forgotten they were also just evidence. Evidence of a life. Evidence that she had been there paying attention, recording what she observed, keeping an account. She went back inside and sat at the table and opened the diary to a blank page and wrote, February 14th, 1875. The matter of Franklin Whitmore is being resolved by a man in Helena who knows what he is doing. I believe it will be finished soon. The word finished means something different than it did last year. She put down the pen. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line, I think I may be home. The confession happened by the fire on a night in late February, when the temperature outside had dropped to the kind of cold that makes the cabin walls creak like a ship in a slow sea, and the fire requires constant attention to hold the warmth in the room. Silas and Drum had gone to bed. The girls were asleep. The house had settled into its nighttime self, which was quieter and in some ways more honest than its daytime self. The way things often are when the activity stops and what remains is simply what is. Caleb sat in the chair by the window. Eleanor sat near the fire with a piece of mending she was not particularly focused on. The lamp on the table was low, and the firelight did most of the work of illuminating the room, which meant the light moved, and with it, the shadows and faces in firelight show things they might otherwise keep private. He said to the window, not to her, I don't know how to do this. She set down the mending. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her directly, and the amber eyes in the firelight were doing the thing she had learned to read over the past weeks, which was the thing they did when he was bringing something up from a depth, and the effort of bringing it showed. This, he said, whatever this is, I have not done it in a long time, and I am not certain I know the way anymore. She did not fill the space with reassurance. She had learned that he did not need reassurance. He needed room. When Nell reads at the table, he said, and she gets to a word she can't manage, and she just waits until I say it. She never looks embarrassed. She just takes the word and goes on. I have been watching her do that for 3 weeks. He paused. I don't know when I stopped doing that, asking for the word and going on. The fire popped. Outside, the coal pressed against the walls. The morning you told me about Franklin, he said, and then you went to bed and I sat at this table. I was not sitting here because I was afraid of him. I was sitting here because you had told me something true, and I needed to think about what it meant that you had chosen to tell me. Not Silas, not a lawyer, me. He looked at the fire. That was the first time since 1869 that I sat at this table at night, and the thinking I was doing was not about the ranch. Eleanor looked at him in the low firelight. I want Nell to keep reading at that table, he said. I want Fern to name every living thing on this property if she has a mind to. I want to come back from the fence in the afternoon and see the lamp in the window. He stopped. The jaw that was always set was doing something slightly different, carrying something that was not resolve, but was more difficult than resolve, which was want. Plain uncomplicated want, which is the most vulnerable thing a person can carry. And I want you to be here because you choose to be, not because it is the available option. The room was very still. Caleb, she said. He waited. I have been choosing since the third morning, she said. When I got up before everyone and I put a log on the fire because it needed one. That was the first time in years I did something because I wanted to do it rather than because I was afraid of what happened if I didn't. She looked at her hands. I noticed the difference. It was not a small difference. He was watching her. I'm not good at this either, she said. I have reasons not to be, but I think the reasons are getting quieter. He looked at her for a long time. The firelight moved across his face and showed the particular quality of him that most people never got close enough to see, which was that beneath the stillness, beneath the years and the grief and the habit of alone, there was something that had been waiting with the patience of something that had learned to wait without bitterness, and it was looking at her now. And it was not asking for anything, but it was present, and it was entirely real. He said, then stay. Not as a demand, not as a plea, as the simplest sentence available, stripped of everything unnecessary, the way all his most important things were stripped of everything unnecessary until what was left was just the thing itself. She looked at him across the fire for a long moment. Yes, she said. But the doubt came back anyway, the way it does not, because she had said the wrong thing, or he had done anything wrong, but because the body carries its own separate memory, and sometimes it wakes you at 2 in the morning with the conviction that warmth is not something you are allowed to keep, that it belongs to other people, that your job is to be grateful for the loan of it while it lasts. She lay awake for 2 nights with that conviction. She examined it the way she examined everything carefully from all sides, with the diary open on the bed beside her, as if its presence could help her determine what was true. On the 3rd night, she made a decision. She would not stay here and let this man's house become something Franklin could contaminate by arriving in it. She would not let her problems become the walls of someone else's rooms. She would not let Nell and Fern grow up knowing that the warmth they lived in had been borrowed from a man who had not really wanted to lend it and would not have if he had been asked honestly. She would go to Millhaven, she and the girls. There was work she could do there. She was a woman who could keep accounts. She was a woman who could teach. She would find something, and it would be hard, and it would not be warm the way this house was warm, but it would be hers, and she would have walked there on her own 2 feet, and that would matter. She packed quietly in the dark while both girls slept. She did not take much. She had not arrived with much. She did take the small carved house. She wrapped it in the cloth from the Bible and put it at the bottom of the bag. At the door, she stopped. She reached into the bag and found Miss Buttonface and sat with the eyeless doll in her hands for a moment. She reached into the small sewing bundle she always carried and pulled out a length of wool, and she sat on the cold floor in the dark in the sleeping house, and she knit very slowly and very quietly a small rough triangle of wool. Not quite a scarf, something like one, just large enough to go around the neck of a doll that had always been cold. She tied it around Miss Buttonface's neck and set the doll on the porch step outside the front door, where the cold received her with the indifference it showed everything. She picked up Fern, who woke only enough to press her face against Eleanor's neck and subside again. She took Nell's hand, and Nell, who woke fully and immediately and took in the door in the dark with her 7-year-old's ability to read a situation without needing it explained. She did not ask. She held her mother's hand. They walked into the Montana dark toward the road to Millhaven. Caleb found the doll on the porch step. He came down in the early dark, as he always did, and found the front door unlocked and the small woolen triangle knotted around Miss Buttonface's neck, and understood everything in the space of a single breath. He stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. Then he went to the barn and saddled the horse, which took 3 minutes because Caleb Hargrove had been saddling horses in the dark since he was 8 years old and did not require light to do what his hands already knew. Silas appeared in the barn doorway, still half-dressed. "I'll be back," Caleb said. Silas looked at the saddled horse. He looked at the door to the house standing open. He looked at his brother, who was pulling the girth strap with the focused economy of a man who is not wasting time on anything that is not forward motion. He said nothing. He stepped out of the way. He found them at Miller Creek, where the pine trees grew thick enough above the bank to keep the snow thinner on the ground beneath. The creek was still frozen, but the thaw had started, and you could hear the water moving under the ice, the first sound of a season finally deciding to change. Eleanor had found a sheltered angle in the roots of the largest pine, and she was kneeling over a small collection of tinder with her hands shaking, trying to strike a fire with flint and steel in the pre-dawn cold. The steel kept glancing, and the tinder refused to catch, and her hands were not steady enough, and the cold was not helping any of it. Nell sat against the pine with Fern in her lap, both of them bundled in what Eleanor had wrapped them in. Nell's face above the cloth, absolutely steady, and Fern's face buried against her sister's shoulder, doing what Fern did, which was to trust the current situation absolutely in the manner of someone who has never been given sufficient reason to stop. Eleanor heard the horse before she saw him. She looked up. Caleb dismounted. He did not hurry. He came across the frozen ground at the deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and is taking the time to do it correctly. He looked at her kneeling in the pine roots with the flint in her shaking hands, and then he looked at the girls, and he crouched down across from her so that his face was at her level. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. Her face in the first gray light had the composed quality she always wore in difficult moments, but there was something behind it that she had not entirely managed to contain, and he could see it. "I don't want to be a burden in your house," she said. "I don't want the girls to grow up thinking warmth is something you borrow from people who did not choose to offer it." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask for you to come," he said. "That's true. Silas did something I wouldn't have done if he'd asked me." She held his eyes. "But Silas didn't make me put more logs on the fire at 3 in the morning," he said. "He didn't make me stand at the workshop window in the dark and hear Fern explaining Montana to a horse and feel something in my chest that I had forgotten the name of." He paused. "And he didn't make me carve a house at 2 in the morning and put it on the mantelpiece next to Margaret, because both of them belong there. Because the past doesn't have to end before something else can begin." Eleanor was very still. "We don't need anyone to fix anything," he said. "Not you, not me. Just a place to belong." She looked at him for a long time in the cold gray light under the pine tree, with the creek moving under its ice and the first pale suggestion of morning coming over the eastern ridge. She did not take his hand when he stood and held it out. She was not ready for that, and he could see that she was not ready, and he did not press. But she stood. She picked up Fern, who surfaced from sleep just long enough to find Eleanor's shoulder and returned to it. Nell stood and took her mother's free hand and looked up at Caleb with the dark, steady eyes that had been looking at the world for 7 years and recording what they found. "Miss Buttonface is on the porch," Nell said. "I know," he said. "She's waiting." He led the horse. Eleanor walked beside him. Nell walked between them, holding her mother's hand, and the Montana morning opened around them as they walked, pale gold coming in from the east over the ridge, the first real warmth the season had offered in months. When they came through the door, Silas was at the stove with coffee, and Drum was at the table with his boots on, and his jaw set at the angle it sat when he had prepared himself for a conversation he was not certain how to have. He looked at Eleanor, and he looked at Nell, and he looked at Fern, still asleep on Eleanor's shoulder, and he said nothing. But he pulled out the chair next to him and set it away from the table a little, in the particular way you set a chair when you want someone to know it is theirs without making an event of it. Eleanor sat. She settled Fern against her, and the child slept on with the absolute indifference of 4-year-olds to the emotional furniture of the adult world around them. Silas put a cup of coffee in front of her. Caleb came in last, having settled the horse. He took his own cup and stood near the window for a moment, looking out at the morning that was properly arriving now, gold and cold, and entirely itself. Then he went to the mantelpiece and looked at the two carved figures standing side by side on the shelf, the kneeling woman and the rough, small house, and he looked at them for a long moment with the particular expression of a man taking account of something. He turned back to the room. He went to the table and he opened the drawer and he took out the spoons. He counted them. He put 4 of them beside 4 cups on the table surface. Not the deliberate gesture of a man making a statement, just the ordinary action of a man setting a table for the people who are going to eat at it. He sat. The morning came in through the window. The fire was warm. Fern slept. Nell had the Bible open on the table and was already running her finger along the lines she had been working on yesterday. Drum had both hands around his cup and his eyes on the table, and the quality of his silence was different from how it had been 4 weeks ago when a freight wagon stopped at the gate, different in a way that might not be obvious to someone who had not been watching him. Silas poured the coffee without being asked, which was the clearest indication anyone had ever given that he understood what had just happened and intended to handle his portion of it correctly going forward. Eleanor put her hand flat on the table. She looked at the 4 spoons. She looked at the fire. She looked at the carved house on the mantelpiece, and the kneeling figure beside it, and the stopped clock in the creek stone, all the objects that held the story of this house in their surfaces. She thought about the red thread at the bottom of her bags, the remnant of a dress, and made a life recut. She thought, this is not borrowed, this is mine. The minister came to Millhaven on the 3rd Thursday of March. Reverend Aldous Creel was a spare man of 60 with a white beard and the unhurried manner of someone who has been conducting the ceremonies of human life long enough to understand that the words matter, but the people saying them matter more. He came through town every 3 weeks on a circuit that covered 4 counties and a considerable stretch of territory that contained more souls than most people in the East would have suspected were living that far into the mountains. Caleb had spoken to him briefly on a trip to Millhaven the previous week, in the manner of a man conducting practical business rather than a romantic consultation. The practical business had been straightforward. The minister had asked one question, which was whether both parties were willing, and Caleb had said yes, and Krill had said he would be in town Thursday. Eleanor did not know about this conversation until Tuesday morning when Caleb told her standing in the kitchen after the girls had gone out in the direct manner he brought to everything important. Thursday, he said, if you want. She looked at him. Reverend Creel, he said, in Millhaven. Silas knows him. Drum will come. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't ask me first. No, he said, I'm asking you now. She looked at his face, at the set jaw and the amber eyes and the quality of stillness that was not withholding but containing the look of a man who has brought everything he has to this moment and is leaving the answer entirely in her hands. Yes, she said. They drove to Millhaven on Thursday morning in the wagon which Silas had cleaned, with an attention to the task that was his particular form of apology made manifest. The sky was the pale blue of late winter, finally running out of conviction. The road was muddy from the thaw, and the horses picked their way with the deliberate care of animals who have crossed this ground 1,000 times and know where it deceives. Nell wore her best dress, which was not very different from her second best dress, but was the one without the mended hem that she could feel when she walked. Fern had been persuaded after a considerable negotiation to leave Miss Buttonface at home on grounds that churches were quiet places, and Miss Buttonface had strong opinions that sometimes escaped into speech. Fern had accepted this argument under protest and had delivered a set of instructions to the doll about appropriate behavior in their absence. The ceremony was in the small white church at the end of Millhaven's main street. Gerald Sims was there standing in the back with his white mustache and his sideways manner of looking at things because Millhaven was a small town and he had been watching this particular situation with the informed interest of a man who had driven the freight wagon. Two women from the town sat in the middle pews with the expressions of people who are genuinely moved and are not ashamed of it. Drum stood to Caleb's left. His gray eyes were fixed on the middle distance with the fixed expression of a man who would deny unto death that his eyes had gone red. Silas stood to Caleb's right. He had the expression of a man who has done something wrong and then spent several months attempting to make it right and is now watching the result and feeling a complex mixture of vindication and humility that he did not yet have the language to describe. He was working on it. Nell held Fern's hand in the front pew. Reverend Creel read the words. When it came to Caleb's part, he said his two words in the deep, quiet voice that he used for the things that mattered, that carried no hedging and no decoration and landed exactly as true as they were meant to. Eleanor heard in them every morning at that table, every log put on a fire without being asked, every word said. When she stumbled, every distance maintained. When distance was what she needed, every action taken that was not for the ranch or for the debt or for the judgment of Homer Banks, but for its own plain necessary sake. She said her words. The morning came through the church windows in long, pale bars, and the floor was cold, and the pews were old, and the whole thing lasted 12 minutes and was entirely sufficient. Afterward, on the church steps, Fern, who had been delivered by Nell with the specific instruction that she was to be quiet and good, said in a voice that carried the full range of the outdoors, "Are you married now?" "Yes," Eleanor said. Fern considered this. "Is Mr. Caleb our papa now?" The porch was very still for a moment. Eleanor looked at Caleb, who was looking at Fern with the amber eyes that showed the thing they showed when they thought no one was watching closely enough to see. "If he wants to be," Eleanor said. Fern turned to Caleb and waited with her gap-toothed patience. He crouched down. He looked at her own level. "I would be glad to be," he said. Fern took this information in. She turned to Nell and conveyed it with a nod. Nell received it with the serious equanimity she brought to information she had already known for a while. Then Fern said, "Can we go home? Miss Buttonface has been alone a long time." In the months that followed, the ranch found its new shape, the way water finds its level without force, following the natural course of the ground, until it rests in the configuration that fits. Silas took on the correspondence with Clarence Webb and Helena with a diligence that was partly conscientiousness and partly the ongoing project of his own contrition. Webb's work proceeded efficiently. Franklin Whitmore, when confronted with the documentation Eleanor's diary provided, and the question of the debt and the dates, did what men in his situation generally do when the arithmetic is genuinely against them. He withdrew. The petition to the territorial court was filed in April, and the legal outcome was what Webb had predicted it would be: a confirmation of Eleanor's widowed status on grounds of fraudulent abandonment, which meant in the practical language of daily life that the matter was concluded. Eleanor received the letter from Webb on a Tuesday morning. She read it at the kitchen table with the window full of spring light and set it down and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment. She went outside where Caleb was working on the fence along the north boundary, and she stood beside him and said, "It's finished." He looked at her. He set down the wire tool. He took her hand, which he did not do often, but did with the particular quiet intention of someone for whom the gesture carries its full weight every time. They stood together at the fence in the spring light for a while and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. The first spring planting went into the ground in May. This was Eleanor's project, undertaken with the systematic thoroughness she brought to every undertaking, which meant it was planned in February from a seed catalog that Sims had in the store, executed according to soil conditions that she had spent 3 months informally assessing and organized in a way that Silas, who had been gardening wrong for years, recognized as immediately superior. Drum built the fence around the garden plot without being asked. He built it low enough that Fern could step over it, which was a choice he did not explain and which Eleanor did not comment on. The first green things came up in June. Fern stood at the garden fence every morning and issued reports on their progress to Miss Buttonface, who was now a permanent fixture on the porch step in the morning hours, positioned to observe the yard. Nell, that same June, informed Eleanor that she wanted to learn everything her mother knew about keeping accounts. She said this at dinner with the directness that had characterized every significant statement she had ever made, and she said it in the particular tone that meant she had been considering it for a while and had now decided the consideration was complete. Eleanor looked at her daughter across the table. "Tomorrow morning," she said, after breakfast. The boy was born in September of 1876. Eleanor had known for months, and the ranch had rearranged itself around the knowing in the way of a household that has developed the habit of adjusting without drama. Silas had ridden for the doctor 4 hours before it was strictly necessary, which was Silas. Drum had found tasks that kept him within hearing distance of the house all day, without he felt sure making this obvious, which was Drum. Caleb had stood outside the bedroom door. This was not a thing he had done with equanimity. He had stood there and he had listened to the sounds inside, and his hands had been at his suitcase. And the particular cold knowledge of what can happen behind a closed door had been with him every minute of it. But standing outside a door is the only honest position when you are not the one who can do what needs doing inside it. When the doctor came out, he was smiling. This was different. Caleb went in. Eleanor was tired in the way of someone who has done hard, necessary work and is resting in the completion of it. She looked at him when he came through the door, and her face had a quality it had sometimes in the early morning, before full wakefulness, when what was underneath the composed surface came through without being filtered. The baby was very small. He was making the sounds new things make when they have arrived in a world that is large and cold relative to where they have been, the sounds of a person still determining what they are going to make of the situation. She held him out. Caleb's hands shook when he took him. He had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, the particular weight of a new person, which is heavier than the size suggests, because it carries with it something beyond mass, the weight of everything they are going to become, which is not yet known, but which exists nonetheless. "Name," Drum said from the doorway where he had appeared without anyone quite tracking when. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Clem," she said, "if that suits you." He looked down at the small face, at the tight closed eyes and the small working mouth, and the enormous uncharted future that was visible somehow in the wrinkled arrangement of 7 pounds of new person. "It suits," he said. Nell was in the room by then, having arrived with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting for this moment with controlled patience and is now prepared to assume appropriate responsibilities. She looked at her brother with the grave attention she gave everything that mattered. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Caleb said. Fern arrived at a run and was redirected from the bed by Nell with the long-practiced authority of a 9-year-old managing a 6-year-old, and stood at the end of the bed with Miss Buttonface held up to observe. "Miss Buttonface says hello," Fern announced. The room was full of people and small voices, and the September light was coming through the window at the low golden angle of the season, and the mantelpiece in the other room held its figures in the same order they had stood in since February. The kneeling woman in the small, rough house, and the stopped clock beside them, that nobody had ever wound, because some things are not about the time and never were. The years that followed built themselves the way years do when the ground is right for them, not without difficulty, not without the hard weather and the failed crops and the winters that test you and the losses that are simply part of living in a place where living requires something, but with the underlying solidity of people who have found their level and settled there. The debt to Homer Banks was cleared in the summer of 1876, paid in full with the proceeds of a cattle sale that Silas had negotiated with a persistence that represented his ongoing and apparently inexhaustible program of making amends. Banks shook Caleb's hand and said something about the value of a settled household that Caleb received without comment, which was, Silas later said, the most polite thing Caleb had ever done in a commercial transaction. Drum found Vera Oaks. This happened in the winter of 1877, and it happened with a symmetry that none of them had planned, and all of them privately found appropriate. Vera Oaks was the daughter of the man who ran the hardware supply in Mill Haven, a woman of 23 who had the quality of stillness in a room that suggested she had learned patience from the same school that had taught Drum his, which was the school of difficult things, survived through the application of quiet persistence rather than noise. Drum did not introduce her to anyone in any formal sense. He simply began over the course of several months to arrive home from supply trips to Millhaven in a slightly better humor than he had departed in, and then one day in March he brought her out to the ranch and stood in the yard with her in the angular way of a man who is doing something unfamiliar and knows he is doing it unfamiliar but has decided to do it anyway. And Eleanor came out and shook her hand and said, "Come in, there's coffee," and that was how it began. The second wedding in the family occurred in June of 1878. Drum was red-faced through the entire ceremony and denied this afterward as predicted. Fern attended and was impeccably quiet and reported to Miss Buttonface on the proceedings in full when they returned home. Silas, for his part, found what he had been looking for in the winter of 1879. Her name was Clara Aldridge, the school teacher who had held the Millhaven position before Nell was old enough to take it, and she had the particular quality of seeing through charm to what lay underneath it, which was perhaps why she was the only woman Silas had ever found genuinely unnerving. She had brown eyes and a directness in conversation that stopped his usual maneuvers before they could start, and he found to his considerable surprise that being seen clearly was not the threat he had always assumed it to be. They married quietly in the spring of 1880, which was how Silas did the things that mattered most to him without ceremony, without announcement, simply by deciding and then doing. The ranch grew. 100 acres to the north added in 1878 when the neighboring claim came available, and Silas saw it before it was advertised, which was exactly the kind of thing Silas was useful for. The cattle count passed 300 in 1880. A chicken house went up that spring. Silas's idea finally realized, and the egg income was exactly as consistent as he had predicted it would be, a fact which he mentioned with restraint and which everyone acknowledged with the grace of people who have learned that being right occasionally is not the same thing as being right generally. Nell became a teacher in 1886. This was not a surprise to anyone who had watched her grow up, but it was understood by all as a significant thing, a 19-year-old woman in a frontier town who had learned through a combination of her mother's instruction in a correspondence curriculum from the Territorial Education Office and a considerable amount of personal stubbornness that knowledge is not ornamental. She taught in the Millhaven schoolhouse to children from the outlying ranches and the town, and she had the particular gift of a teacher who never mistakes the patience required for slowness of intelligence. Fern named everything she encountered for the rest of her childhood, and into her adult life, a habit that did not diminish with age but simply expanded its territory to include the horses of every household. She entered the dogs of Millhaven's main street, and eventually the children of her siblings, each of whom received from Fern, on the occasion of their birth, a small, specific observation about their character that turned out in every case to be accurate. The summer of 1894 arrived in the particular way that 20th anniversaries arrive when you have not been counting, which is to say it was simply there one morning, a June morning, with the light coming in at the angle that it had come in for 20 years in that kitchen, and Eleanor was at the table with a cup of coffee and the account books she kept for the ranch, which were organized with a precision that Silas had come to depend on completely, in which Clem, who was 17 and beginning to learn the management of the property from his father, was studying with the focused attention that reminded Eleanor of someone she had known at 7. Caleb was outside. She could hear the sound of the axe on the splitting stump, the steady rhythm of it, which was unchanged in 20 years, except that the pace was slightly slower now, calibrated to the back that had given him trouble since the winter of 1888, and that he managed by adjusting his method rather than stopping, which was the same thing he did with most things that tried to stop him. She went to the window and looked out. The yard was full. Drum's 2 girls were chasing each other through the garden, which had grown in 20 years from Eleanor's careful planting to something that produced in summer enough vegetables to supply 3 households and employ Fern's youngest boy in the afternoons for wages. Silas was at the fence on the south boundary with his son beside him, teaching the fence repair that Caleb had once taught him, the information passing down through the generation with the same practical efficiency as the morning coffee. Clem was in the barn. You could tell by the sound the particular rhythm of him moving among the horses, which he had learned from Caleb in the same wordless, patient way that Caleb had learned it from William and William, from whoever had taught him in whatever earlier time and place he had come from. And on the porch step in the June morning, Fern's youngest daughter, who was 4 years old with apple cheeks and a gap between her front teeth, and every quality that suggested the world was a comprehensible and generally benevolent place if you paid sufficient attention to it, was sitting with a cloth doll and explaining Montana. The doll had button eyes, new ones blue sewn on years ago by Fern with careful stitches. Miss Buttonface had been handed down with the solemnity of an heirloom, and the child was introducing her to the garden fence with the tone of someone conducting important social business. Eleanor watched this from the window and felt the things she felt in the morning, sometimes the things she had not had a name for when she first noticed it years ago, and had since stopped needing to name because it had become simply the texture of the days, the underlying quality of a life lived in a place that is genuinely yours. The axe stopped. She looked to the right. Caleb had set it down against the stump and was standing in the yard looking at his granddaughter and the doll. He was 52 years old, and the years were in him the way years are in anything that has been shaped by honest use in the gray at his temples, in the slower pace and the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they had been. But his eyes were unchanged, the amber of them warm, warm in the morning light, carrying the thing they had always carried under the surface of his stillness, which was the thing that she had needed enough time close to him to learn to read. He felt her watching. He turned and looked at the window. She raised her cup. He lifted his chin once, which meant everything it had always meant, which was good morning, and you are here, and this is the day we have, and that is sufficient. She went back to the account books. On the mantelpiece in the main room, undisturbed since February of 1875, the kneeling figure in the small, rough house stood on either side of the stop clock, and beside the stop clock, the oval creek stone, and on the far end of the shelf, in the spot that Fern's daughter had established, with the authority of 4 years old, Miss Buttonface sat in her blue button-eyed silence and observed the room with a particular sightedness of things that have been loved long enough to absorb something of what they've been held through. The fire in the hearth was the same fire. Different wood, different year, same heat. The table was the same table. There were more chairs around it now, but the wood was the same wood. The window let in the same light. She still remembered stepping off that freeway and into the Montana cold, the mist of her breath in the December air. The address in her hand, the two girls beside her, and one of them already running ahead, because that was who she was, and the door opening, and the man who had not been written to standing in it, frozen in a way she had not understood then, and had come to understand entirely. 20 years. She had come west with nothing. The money was nearly gone. The options were nearly gone. The thread of the old life had worn down to a single strand, and she had cut it herself in a second-hand shop on Chestnut Street and kept the piece in her bag as a reminder of what can be unmade and remade. From outside came the sound of Fern's daughter asking Miss Buttonface what Montana smelled like, and then providing the answer herself, which was cold and good, and like Papa's coat. Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at the account books, at the numbers that added up to a life, the cattle count, in the grain stores, in the fence materials, in the seed orders, in the wages for the boy who worked the garden, in the ongoing correspondence with Clarence Webb, who now handled several neighboring ranches as well, and who sent his regards every quarter with the affection of a man who had been witness to something that turned out well. She thought about $37.50 in a newspaper left on an omnibus seat, and 4 words that had stopped her the way nothing had stopped her in years. Honest treatment, guaranteed. She thought he kept that word every morning for 20 years. In the coffee put before her, in the logs put on the fire, and the hand held at the fence in the spring light when the letter arrived that said finished. In the axe instruction, in the kept distance, in the 2 lines on a scrap of paper by a carved house on the kitchen table. In the presence at the gate, in the crouching in the pine roots at Miller Creek, in the single word, not a promise, but a fact, the simplest sentence available to a man who did not waste language: stay. She heard his boots on the porch step. He came in the way he always did, without announcement. Simply present the way the heat of a fire is present, not requiring acknowledgement to be real. He poured his coffee. He sat across from her at the table with the account books between them and looked at the numbers with the interest he had developed over 20 years for the story they told, which was a story about ground and weather and animals and seasons and the slow accumulation of one honest year on top of another. North Pasture comes in well this summer, he said. If the weather holds, she said. It'll hold, and he said. He had been reading Montana weather for 30 years and was generally right. She looked at him across the account books in the summer morning, with the sound of their granddaughter explaining things to a doll on the porch outside and the smell of coffee and pine and 20 years of ordinary days. And she thought of a December night when she had written in a diary that she did not know what a man making room for strangers in his house meant. She knew now. She had known for a long time. The door was open, the fire was warm, the light was theirs. She turned the page.